The Edmonton Oilers' goal has long been to win their organization's first Stanley Cup since 1990. In that pursuit, they've needed to maintain contender status for an extended period of time to get a lot of kicks at the can. On today's episode of Locked On Oilers, a conversation about how the Oilers can maintain contender status into the near future for the duration of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl's primes.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's show, which was inspired by yesterday's episode where we compared Stuart Skinner to some of the recent goalies that have gone to conference finals, cup finals, won the Stanley Cup, I wanted to have an extended conversation about how the Oilers maintain this window of contention as long as they possibly can. And there are a few components to this conversation. We're going to start with the superstars. We'll hit on Connor and Leon to open the show, what you can realistically expect from them, how the team can plan around them, both in terms of the lineup and in terms of financials with the cap hits that are going to kick in. Connor's number, obviously, we don't know and probably won't know until this summer. Leon, we know, is coming in at $14 million. He'll be the highest paid player in the NHL next year. Our second segment, we're going to talk about the supporting cast, who's here short-term, who's here long-term, how long-term is actually long-term, and then we're going to tie a bow on that by looking at some of the examples around the NHL as to how to glide into that next phase. And that's the appropriate metaphor. You know, you think about Toy Story, we're not flying, we're falling, we're gliding, we're falling with style. That's kind of your goal. You want to be able to stick the landing with the superstar players as they reach that final phase of their careers. So to open up, to set the table, we understand that hockey, the NHL in particular, the amount of variance in the postseason, it creates a environment where even if you are making progress or even if you feel like you've improved the team, you're not necessarily going to correlate that with results. And it's one of the real conundrums we have in evaluation in terms of performance, because every single aspect of the game, you can outplay your opponent, but if you just don't get the bounces in 4 games in a best of 7, you're out. You can be the better team, the more talented team. You can control play. You can win on special teams. But if the other team scores more, you might lose. And look, this is not intended to be a defense of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Carolina Hurricanes, the New York Rangers, the Dallas Stars, teams who have consistently made the postseason, but for one reason or another haven't been able to break through that glass ceiling. But one of the key components of the NHL over the last 15 years in this salary cap era, whether we're talking about teams that have won the Stanley Cup or teams that have come close, is having 2 elite forwards. That is the prerequisite for admission into this club. You need to have the 2 superstar forwards at minimum. Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl check those boxes. When you go through recent NHL history, you talk about Matthew Tkachuk and Sasha Barkov. They've been there. You talk about Jack Eichel and Mark Stone. They've been there. You go before that, Colorado, Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, Nikita Kucherov and Steven Stamkos, or Braden Point, because the first Cup final, the Lightning one, Steven Stamkos didn't play in. Then you go to St. Louis, extreme outlier. St. Louis does not have 2 elite forwards. That was a team you would argue. Its 2 best players were probably Ryan O'Reilly and Alex Pietrangelo, and then you would probably say Colton Parayko was probably the next best player on that team. But St. Louis is really the one team that kind of sticks out as being an extreme outlier. You think about that Bruins team that had David Pastrnak and Patrice Bergeron. That Bruins team a little closer to what we would typically expect that archetype to look like. Washington, Nick Backstrom, Alex Ovechkin, easy. Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, easy. Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane, easy. Anze Kopitar, and in the Kings' case, Drew Doughty. You're not going to say Dustin Brown. You're not going to say Marion Gaborik. You're not going to say any of those guys. That Bruins team 14 years ago now at this point, 13 years ago at this point. That team, probably the last one we can't do the 2-star players on before the Blues. So we'll put an axe there. We'll put that as our point of demarcation. But the first component to maintaining contender status is having those building block superstar forwards, over a point per game, positive defensive impacts, unless you're extreme. If you're Nikita Kucherov, you can get away with having mediocre defensive impacts because you are so dominant offensively that it's a waste of your time to worry about defense. And the first part of this, Connor and Leon right now are coming in at a great number. When you think about it abstractly, the Oilers have Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl under contract for $21 total million. That's it. $21 total million for 2 top 5 players in the entire NHL. The conundrum becomes then, how do we maintain contender status while keeping our superstars? The Maple Leafs are going to run into this issue this upcoming summer when Mitch Marner, who has been one of the 10 to 15 best players in the NHL over the last 5 to 6 years, becomes an unrestricted free agent at his peak earning potential against the backdrop of a team that is trying to maintain where they're at and still improve. And that's really where this conversation becomes a challenge. Not only do you need to maintain what you already have, you need to keep building on that. As Austin Matthews and William Nylander and Mitch Marner, should he stay in Toronto, get older, maintaining that level, that quality, becomes more challenging because not only do you need those guys to stave off aging curves, you need to put a supporting cast around them, and then you need that supporting cast to be actively good, but you're paying all 3 of them their sticker price. You are paying them fair market value that you could get them under contract for unless they actively choose to take less money. In the Oilers case, it depends. If I were Connor McDavid's agent, I would tell him you should do a 4-year deal. I would tell him you should try and hit free agency again at 32 or 33. We can both account for cap increase so we can get you paid more. We have security, and because it's going to be a shorter contract, we could ask for 15 and a half, 16, maybe even $17 million per year because it's only a 4-year deal. Now, if Connor values sustainability, flexibility, and wants to take an 8-year deal for $12 and a half, $13 million per year and really help the Oilers out, that's a different conversation. Nothing I know would lead me to believe that would be the case. I think more than anything, I think if you are an agent advising players right now, I would be telling them you want to look at 3, 4, 5-year deals at the longest, because we don't know what the upper boundary of this salary cap is going to look like 5 to 10 years from now. If you're Connor McDavid, don't want to take $15 and a half, $16 million a year for the next 8 years this summer coming up. That'll kick in after next season. If the salary cap could be as much as $140 or $150 million by the end of that contract, if you were to take 8 years. So I think there's a strong case in both parties' cases. If you're the Oilers, you give him a little bit more cap, and you take a little bit less term. And that puts both guys in a position where Connor maximizes his earnings. The Oilers can reassess where they're at in 4 years and go from there, because and this will be the last point before we take our first break today. There's no way to know how Connor and Leon are going to age. The supposition is because they're both superstar players, they're going to age pretty gracefully. And even if their defense begins to erode, if Connor's skating begins to erode, there's enough talent there on a baseline level that they're going to be able to offset some of that age-related regression. Now, you're going to need to nail the supporting cast, and we're going to talk about that coming up next, but it's not impossible. But, and I'll leave you with this thought. You think about the teams that have won, their star players have generally been in this age bracket, that 27, 28, 29, when you think about Tampa Bay and Florida and Vegas, St. Louis, Washington, guys close to their peak counting stats, because that's generally when they're going to be at their most powerful, when they're going to be at their most impactful. But we are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we're going to start to dive into what the supporting cast is going to look like going forward and into the near future. And here's a hint. There's not a whole lot tied down right now.
Did you know getting a good night's sleep is the #1 recipe for long-term success in life? I didn't. It took me way longer to realize than I'd like to admit. It was years of tossing and turning. I was always tired. I never felt like I could live up to my potential, but not anymore. Thanks to Bear Mattress. I used their sleep quiz and I matched with the Elite Hybrid. It's perfect for side sleepers like me. Now I wake up energized. I'm getting deeper sleeps and I'm ready to attack the day. No matter how you sleep, Bear Mattress has a match for you with a focus on recovery, cooling, and pressure relief to upgrade your sleep and improve your overall quality of life. Go to bearmattress.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL at checkout for 40% off site-wide. This offer is not available anywhere else. You have to use my promo code on the very last page of checkout to get this discount. That's bearmattress.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for 40% off site-wide. Bearmattress.com, promo code LOCKEDONNHL.
Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, as we're opening up and we're having a bit more of a forward-looking conversation. The Oilers are going to make the playoffs this year. They are not as deep and frankly probably not playing as good of hockey entering the postseason this year as they were last year, but it's possible. And that's the beauty of these playoffs, where anything can happen and it's there for the taking. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about sports is when you are doubted, when people don't think you can do something, you can prove them wrong. It's not the same as the rest of us who have to operate within certain structures of a workplace. NHL players, professional athletes, if they feel like they're being disrespected, they can go out there and they can prove the naysayers wrong. And I think that's one of the things that I've always loved and gravitated towards sports for, is that at their essence, sports are supposed to be the ultimate meritocracy, where the best man wins and we go home. Of course, it's not as simple as that. There's luck, there's variance. When you talk about a single game versus a series versus a whole season, different environmental factors come into play. But as we talk about maintaining contender status, we've established that the Oilers have the most important parts and frankly the most difficult parts. I think most people would tell you that the biggest barrier to becoming a real Stanley Cup contender is the superstar talent, because there are a finite number of truly elite players. And for clarification purposes, I am quantifying elite as somebody I could argue as being in the top 15 to 20 players in the entire sport. Below that, you have superstars, you have very good players, and I'll make this point very straightforward and very simple. Connor McDavid is an elite hockey player. Sebastian Aho is an all-star caliber player. Sebastian Aho is a very good player. He can be a point per game piece. He can be probably the third or fourth best forward on a Stanley Cup winning hockey team. But he doesn't have that dynamism to his game that makes Connor McDavid who he is. And that dynamic ability is an inherent part of getting to that elite tier. You can be the jack of all trades type. You can be a Brock Nelson, a Vincent Trocheck, a Chris Kreider. And I'm using Vincent Trocheck and Chris Kreider more in past terms, in years past, where really good at most areas of the game, but not elite at anything. And that's really kind of the difference between a superstar and an all-star and an elite player. And the Oilers, for so much of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl's tenure, have struggled to have a sufficient supporting cast. You think about the laundry list of guys they've brought in over the years as get right quick schemes, as get rich quick schemes, whether it's adding grit like Zach Kassian or Milan Lucic, whether it's going to the bargain bin for guys like Evander Kane or Corey Perry. There has always been an understanding that you need to get as much quality talent around your best players as possible. And it's really a differentiation point once you get to a certain part in the postseason. You think about the Panthers last year, Anton Lundell in that third line. You think about the Vegas third line with Brett Howden. You think about the Tampa Bay third line with Blake Coleman, Barclay Goodrow, and Yanni Gourde. You think about that Colorado middle six, we'll say, where they were able to add Arturi Lehkonen in season. He made a huge difference because it's not enough to just have the superstars. Most of the teams you're going to play once you get past the first round, they're going to have a really good player. You know, you just rattle it through your brain. You think about the Oilers last year, who was in the second round of the playoffs in the Western Conference last year. You talk about Vancouver, you talk about Colorado, Dallas, and the Oilers. And Vancouver, you know, Elias Pettersson, I think, is on the outskirts of that conversation. I think this year he's having a bit of a down year, but I think in years past, you could very easily make an argument for him being a top 30, top 35, top 20 player at his absolute best. You talk about Dallas, and I love Jason Robertson. He hasn't really been that tier of player the last 14 to 18 months. I think he's a little bit closer probably to the 40s than a top 20 now, but they've added Mikko Rantanen, so that changes their calculus. But as far as the Oilers and going forward, flexibility is probably the single most important component in maintaining contender status. You need to be liquid. You need to be able to move players in or out of your roster. And that means shorter term contracts. That means more expensive year over year average annual values. It means avoiding giving no movement clauses and no trade clauses whenever you can, because those only make your calculus more difficult. And when you look, and I'm looking over at my notes here, you have Connor for one more year under contract after this season. Leon's under contract till 2033. He's not going anywhere. Zach Hyman is under contract for 3 more seasons. Evander Kane is under contract for 1 more season. Nuge is under contract for 3 more. Arvidsson and Henrique, 1 more year. Matthias Janmark, 2 more years. Max Jones and Vasily Podkolzin, 1 more year each. Matthias Ekholm, 1 more year. Darnell Nurse, under contract until 2030. Evan Bouchard is going to be the 3rd most expensive player on this team 2 years from now because he's deserved it. He has a unique skill set, and the offense-first defenseman is a valuable archetype. 1 more year of Jake Wallman, 1 more year of Brett Kulak, and 1 more year of Troy Stetcher. I imagine they won't be bringing John Klingberg back next year. Ty Emberson is an RFA. Skinner and Pickard are both under contract for next season. So with all of that in mind, that tells you a few things. Number one, you are going to need a first pair left-handed defenseman in the not too distant future. If you think that's Jake Wallman, by all means, if you think Jake Wallman, who's 28, 29, I think 29, Jake Wallman is 29. You can realistically tell me we think we can get 3 or 4 more years out of him after this contract is over. I don't think that's implausible. He moves very well. He doesn't hit a lot. That type of play won't age him aggressively. I can see a world where he can easily transition into a mid to late 30s Nick Leddy like he was on the Islanders when they were going to the conference final a couple of years ago under Barry Trotz. That's conceivable, but Nurse is not going to age particularly gracefully. He's already 30 and he's under contract for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more seasons. Under contract until 35, 36 years old. He's not going to age that well. You need another left-handed defenseman to build out around. And then the forward group is more curious because you imagine Nuge is going to transition more to the wing, even though he had a nice game at center last night against Utah, and Chris Knobloch said they want to keep him at center if they can help it. You're probably going to transition him to the wing going forward into the near future. Evander Kane, we know they probably would like to move to get more flexible. Zach Hyman, you don't know how he's going to age. He's 32 now. He's under contract for 3 more seasons. Could he play into his mid to late 30s and be a 20-30 goal guy? Maybe. And that's really the conundrum here because you have him, you have Nuge, you have Connor, you have Leon. those are really your building blocks. The middle and bottom six, Arvidsson, Henrique, Skinner, Janmark, Perry, Connor Brown, Kapanen, all those guys are under contract only for one more year or 2 more years at the most. Someone like Janmark, okay, your fourth line center's under contract till he's 34, 35. That's not particularly cost prohibitive, especially with the cap going up. But you are going to need some answers going forward into the not so near future as far as how do we maintain Connor and Leon's contender status as a team, because they're going to keep being productive players, but they're going to need more help. They're going to need more defensively reliable players. They're going to need a bottom half of the lineup that can contribute a little bit more offensively and be active defensively. But we need to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we're going to tackle how the Oilers can look around the league at some of the examples of teams that have transitioned well as their star players have aged. Coming up next, right after this. Daylight savings snuck up on us again, and if you're feeling that lost hour of sleep, 5-Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need a little boost to power through. Whether you're staying up watching the NCAA tournament, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just trying to keep up with the workday, 5-Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up whenever you need it. You guys know I'm in the Eastern time zone doing the Oilers games. I am up late. 5-Hour Energy helps me stay awake the next day. With these longer days, you love getting outside, spending that extra time working out. Sometimes need a little bit of extra pick-me-up to get it done. Head to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 different flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even build your own 12 or 24 pack delivered right to your door. Need one now? Grab a 5-Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They're everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers as we talk how to be a contender long term. And I think it's absolutely crucial to emphasize that it takes time to get the right mix. The Tampa Bay Lightning drafted Steven Stamkos and Victor Hedman 9-10 years before they ever won a Stanley Cup. The Golden Knights didn't exist 10 years before they won the Stanley Cup. The Florida Panthers drafted Sasha Barkov more than 10 years before they won their Stanley Cup. The Avalanche drafted Nathan McKinnon, I think 8 years before they won their Stanley Cup. This stuff takes time, and getting the right mix around your superstars and having the quality depth is essential. Because when you think about it, these teams that finally broke through, it was finding the Sam Reinhart and Sam Bennett for Florida. For Vegas, it was getting Ivan Barbashev and Mark Stone and finding depth pieces that were able to be impactful, like a Brett Howden or a Nick Hague. Colorado, getting Nazem Kadri in the Tyson Barrie trade and finding a way to improve the quality of your depth and giving your star players a little bit more room to kind of shine. And it's really hard to do, and it's very easy for your team to A, miss their shot, or B, in trying to maintain your position, have the bottom fall out from under you. I can point very easily to the Boston Bruins and the New York Rangers as two teams that firmly felt they were very much still contenders, and then you started to look at their roster and say, well, he's old, and he's old, and he's old, and he's old. How are they going to maintain this for another 2 or 3 years? And both teams have guys in their respective primes. The Bruins have Pasta, McAvoy, and Swayman, who are all capable of being what they are on a Stanley Cup caliber team. And that's more than enough as a foundation. Of course, you need another great forward for Pasta to play with and to take some of the workload off of him, but that's a foundation. That should work. You think about the Rangers with Adam Fox and Igor Shesterkin. Then you go to all their forwards who are all old, or Alexis Lafreniere's case, underperforming. And very quickly, you start to get a picture of how this happens. And it sneaks up on you. That's really the most important takeaway I want people to have when they think about maintaining a contender for an extended period of time. It's very easy for the bottom to fall out. It is very easy for good players to become average players. It's very easy for great players to become good players. And those marginal fall offs is where contenders start to fall apart. And maintaining your contender status as your group evolves is a real challenge. And you think about how Tampa Bay got to a cup final in 2015, where Nikita Kucherov was like the 8th or 9th most commonly used forward on that team. And they had big roles for Andre Palat and Tyler Johnson. And 5 years later, it was Braden Point and Anthony Cirelli who they were able to incubate, to bring along, and to develop. And you think about the stars of last decade, the Dallas Stars, with the Sagan and Ben led forward group, and Essa Lindell and John Klingberg and Ben Bishop. And they were good. They made a cup final. They made a conference final. But that group really wasn't able to maintain or improve, frankly, until they managed to land a draft where they took Ottinger and Jason Robertson and Rope Hintz. Oh, and they got a Miro Heiskanen in there as well. And you look at Washington last year versus this year, where they took some calculated swings. They brought in Nick Roy, traded for Jacob Chychrun, traded for Pierre-Luc Dubois. They had signed Dylan Strome. They drafted Connor McMichael. They drafted Alexei Protas, and casually and surely started to find supporting cast members to help out Alex Ovechkin. And I do think it's fair to say I don't think the Capitals are a team capable of winning the Stanley Cup this year, in spite of their regular season record, in spite of their pursuit for the President's Trophy. I think they are uniquely equipped to be a very good regular season team through their depth, but I would point you to teams like the Carolina Hurricanes, the Seattle Kraken team that made the playoffs a couple years ago. Of it's great you can roll all 4 lines, all 3 pairs, you trust everyone, but where are your dogs? Where are your boys? And I think Alexei Protas is really good. I've been thoroughly impressed with his game right now this season, but I don't think they have any game breakers. You know, I go back to my gym class theory, where if you lined everyone up on the line and we pick teams to play ball hockey, I'm taking at least 3 guys on the Oilers before I'm taking the first Capital. I think you could make that argument for a lot of the teams in the Eastern Conference. If you were to do the Panthers, you're definitely taking Barkov and Tkachuk before you're taking anyone on Washington. You might take Sergei Bobrovsky before you take anyone on Washington. You might take Gustav Forsling before anyone you take on Washington. Tampa Bay, same deal. You're taking Kucherov, you're taking Braden Point, you're taking Victor Hedman, you're taking Andrei Vasilevsky. You could even do this with Carolina. Now, I think the conversation's a lot closer if we're doing the gym class theory for Carolina versus Washington, but I'm still probably going to take someone like a Jacob Slavin before I'm going to take anyone on Washington. I'm very well might take Sebastian Aho before I take anyone on Washington. But that's the beauty of this theory and why it's compelling and why I think it's useful for this conversation, because we're talking about being a Stanley Cup caliber team, not a playoff team. It doesn't take a lot to make these playoffs. I don't know if you guys are looking at the standings or not. We're talking about Ottawa and Columbus and Montreal and the Islanders and the Rangers. Out west, we're talking about the Flames, Utah, St. Louis. None of these teams are good. But someone has to make the playoffs because of the way these formats are set up. So for the Oilers to maintain throughout the rest of Connor and Leon's primes, you're going to start to need to graduate some younger pieces. You are going to need all of the guys over the years that the Oilers have drafted and have never made it to the NHL. You're going to need some of those guys to be bottom sixers. You're going to need them to be cheap. You're going to need them to be cost effective. And it's really important that the Oilers do find a wave of youth to add to this group, because it's impossible to maintain a contender status through free agency and trades. It is too expensive and it hollows out your organization, and you end up like the Bruins, you end up like the Rangers, you end up like the Canucks. You need to slowly integrate younger players over time, so that way, as your older players decline, line, you have people to pick up the slack. Otherwise, you end up overpaying for guys like Elias Lindholm and Vincent Trocheck when you should have been worried about developing Mason Lohrei or Alexi Lafreniere. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On NHL, covering all of the biggest stories across the league from the local experts of Locked On. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Until then, let's go Oilers.